In 1939, one of the most catastrophic events in human history began. The European age of tenuous peace that had held since the end of the First World War was about to shatter into pieces. Over the next 6 years, Germany, Japan, Italy, and their allies would engulf the world in a conflict that would claim over 70 million lives. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union would form an unprecedented alliance to defeat the Axis powers. Yet, at the center of this global conflagration stood one man whose rise from obscurity to absolute power defied all logic and reason. He was a failed artist, a homeless vagrant, a decorated but lowly soldier, and a political agitator who transformed himself into the dictator of one of Europe's most powerful nations. This is the story of Adolf Hitler and how one man's twisted vision led the entire world into the Second World War. Adolf Hitler's origins were remarkably unremarkable. He was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town in Austria-Hungary close to the border with Germany. He was the fourth of 6 children born to Alois Hitler and his third wife, Clara Posel, with 3 of his siblings dying in infancy. The family's circumstances were modest but not destitute. Alois Hitler worked as a customs official and had established himself as a respectable civil servant, providing his family with a comfortable middle-class existence. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lurked a deeply dysfunctional family dynamic that would shape the future dictator's psychology. Young Adolf was described as a resentful, discontented child who was moody, lazy, and of unstable temperament. He was deeply hostile towards a strict, authoritarian father and strongly attached to his indulgent, hard-working mother. The relationship with his father was particularly fraught. Alois Hitler was a domineering figure with a short temper who would savagely beat his son if he did not comply with his wishes. Hitler later recalled deliberately steeling himself against showing pain during these beatings, counting each blow to prove his toughness to himself. When Hitler was 3 years old, the family briefly moved to Passau, Germany, where he acquired the distinctive Lower Bavarian dialect that marked his speech throughout his life. The family then returned to Austria, settling eventually in Linz, the capital of Upper Austria. Linz remained Hitler's favorite city throughout his life, and he expressed his wish to be buried there. Hitler's formal education was undistinguished at best. Although Hitler feared and disliked his father, he was a devoted son to his mother, and with mixed record as a student, he never advanced beyond a secondary education. The death of his father in 1903 removed the pressure on young Adolf to pursue a respectable career in the civil service. Instead, he began nurturing dreams of becoming an artist, much to the frustration of his family's expectations. In 1907, tragedy struck the Hitler household. Throughout 1907, Hitler helped care for his mother, who was dying of breast cancer. Her death in December 1907 was a shattering blow to the adolescent Hitler. Interestingly, the physician who treated her, Dr. Edward Bloch, was Jewish, and Hitler and Dr. Bloch developed a good relationship, with Hitler expressing his gratitude for Bloch's help and care. Years later, when the Nazis took over Austria, Hitler saw to it that Dr. Bloch and his wife were exempted from many of the regime's anti-Semitic policies. In early 1908, some weeks after his mother's death, Hitler moved to Vienna. He harbored ambitions of studying art and becoming a painter. However, reality had other plans. Hitler was rejected from Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts, not once but twice, in 1907 and 1908. These rejections devastated the young Hitler and set him adrift in one of Europe's greatest cities with no clear purpose or direction. At first, Hitler lived fairly well in Vienna, having a generous inheritance left by his parents, and he did not work. But this situation could not last forever. In December 1909, he ran out of money and was forced to live in homeless shelters, drifting from one municipal hostel to another. He then lived in a men's public dormitory until 1913, earning money as a casual laborer and by selling his paintings and postcards of Vienna sights to little success. It was during these years in Vienna that Hitler later claimed his worldview began to take shape. Vienna at the turn of the century was a cauldron of ethnic tensions and competing ideologies. Unlike Linz, where the population was overwhelmingly German, Vienna was multi-ethnic, multinational, and multi-religious, with a Viennese population including sizable Jewish and Czech populations. Hitler hated the cosmopolitanism and multinational character of Vienna. For the first 2 years that Hitler was in Vienna, anti-Semitic politician Karl Lueger was the city's mayor. Lueger was regularly re-elected on a virulently anti-Semitic program. Hitler later claimed that his anti-Semitic political ideology was formed in Vienna, saying Lueger and the city's anti-Semitic newspapers partly inspired it. However, the reality is more complex. In Vienna, Hitler had Jewish acquaintances and business associates, and based on existing evidence, Hitler did not adopt a comprehensive anti-Semitic ideology until after he had left Vienna. From crackpot racial theorists like the defrocked monk Lanz von Liebenfels and the Austrian pan-German leader George von Schauner, the young Hitler learned to discern an eternal Jew, the symbol and cause of all chaos, corruption, and destruction in culture, politics, and economy. He absorbed theories that blamed Jews for everything from prostitution and disease to capitalism, Marxism, democracy, and pacifism. In May 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich, the capital of the German state of Bavaria, when he was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army. He journeyed to Salzburg on February 5, 1914 for medical assessment, and after he was deemed unfit for service, he returned to Munich. Hitler later claimed that he did not wish to serve the Habsburg Empire because of the mixture of races in his army and his belief that the collapse of Austria-Hungary was imminent. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 transformed Hitler's life completely. When World War I broke out, Hitler successfully petitioned the Bavarian king to be allowed to volunteer in a reserve infantry regiment. According to a 1924 report by the Bavarian authorities, allowing Hitler to serve was most likely an administrative error, because as an Austrian citizen, he should have been returned to Austria. Posted to Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, he served as a dispatch runner on the Western Front in France and Belgium. He was continuously in the front line as a headquarters runner, and his bravery in action was rewarded with the Iron Cross, second class, in December 1914, and the Iron Cross, first class, in August 1918. The Iron Cross First Class was a rare decoration for someone of Hitler's lowly rank as a corporal. Hitler served throughout the war, was wounded in October 1916, and was gassed 2 years later near Ypres. He was wounded twice during conflict. He was hit in the leg during the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and temporarily blinded by a British gas attack near Ypres in 1918. A month later, he was recuperating in a hospital at Pasewalk, northeast of Berlin, when news arrived of the armistice and Germany's defeat in World War I. The news of Germany's surrender devastated Hitler. Like many Germans, Hitler came to believe the country's devastating defeat could be attributed not to the Allies, but to insufficiently patriotic traitors at home, a myth that would undermine the post-war Weimar Republic and set the stage for Hitler's rise. This stab-in-the-back legend would become a central pillar of Nazi ideology, claiming that Germany's undefeated army had been betrayed by Jewish politicians, communists, and other internal enemies. Modern scholars, particularly Hitler biographer Ian Kershaw, tend to see these years during and after World War I, rather than the Vienna period, as a time when Hitler's ideas about Jews really became fixed. The chaos and humiliation of defeat, combined with the revolutionary upheavals that swept Germany in 1918 to 1919, crystallized Hitler's hatreds into a coherent worldview. After the war, Hitler remained in Munich, a city that had become a hotbed of right-wing extremism and bitter veterans nursing grudges against the new democratic Weimar Republic. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany, including massive reparations payments, territorial losses, and severe restrictions on the German military. These humiliating terms became a rallying cry for nationalist movements across Germany. In 1919, Hitler was still in the army and was assigned to investigate political groups in Munich. One such group was the German Workers' Party, a small nationalist organization. Hitler attended a meeting of this party and was drawn to its message of German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and opposition to the Versailles Treaty. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, DAP, the precursor of the Nazi Party, and in 1921 was appointed the leader of the Nazi Party. The party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, commonly known as the Nazi Party. Hitler proved to be a mesmerizing public speaker, able to channel the frustrations and resentments of his audiences into political energy. His speeches were theatrical performances filled with dramatic gestures, carefully calibrated pauses, and almost hypnotic rhythm that captivated crowds. The Nazi Party grew rapidly in the chaotic atmosphere of early Weimar Germany. The country was racked by economic crisis, including hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of the middle class. Political violence was common, with armed paramilitary groups from both left and right engaging in street battles. In this volatile environment, the Nazis presented themselves as the only force capable of restoring order and German greatness. By 1923, Hitler believed the time was ripe for revolution. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922, Hitler's goal was to use Munich as a base for a march against Germany's national government in Berlin. The plan was to overthrow the Bavarian government first, then march on the national capital. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers staged what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. On the evening of November 8th, Hitler and approximately 600 Sturmabteilung SA members marched on the Beer Hall Bürgerbräukeller, where Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the minister-president of Bavaria, was delivering a speech. As the SA surrounded the hall, Hitler entered, fired a shot into the ceiling, and claimed that the Bavarian government had been overthrown and that the national revolution had begun. Hitler forced Kahr and other Bavarian leaders to support his putsch at gunpoint. However, when he left to help his followers seize military barracks and returned, he was furious to learn that the trio had been allowed to leave after promising to keep their word. And once free, they immediately turned on Hitler and crushed the coup. On the following morning, November 9th, 1923, Hitler led a demonstration through the streets of Munich, aiming to take control of the War Ministry building. Armed police blocked their route, and violence broke out on both sides, with 14 Nazis and 4 policemen being killed. Hitler suffered a dislocated shoulder in the melee, and the Nazi next to him was fatally shot in the chest. Hitler fled the scene and was arrested 2 days later on November 11th, 1923. The Beer Hall Putsch appeared to be a complete disaster. The Nazi Party was banned, many of its leaders were imprisoned, and Hitler faced charges of high treason. The New York Times declared that the Munich Putsch definitely eliminates Hitler and his National Socialist followers. But they could not have been more wrong. Hitler was found guilty of treason and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. However, Landsberg was a relatively comfortable prison, intended for inmates who were considered misguided rather than dangerous, and Hitler was allowed to receive visitors as well as fan mail from admirers. On December 20th, 1924, having served only 9 months, Hitler was released. The trial itself became a propaganda triumph for Hitler. Hitler's trial became political theater. He attacked the Weimar government and portrayed himself as a patriot who hoped to revive Germany's spirits and its sense of greatness. His defense speeches were printed in newspapers across Germany, transforming him from a regional agitator into a national figure. While in prison, Hitler dictated his political autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to his deputy Rudolf Hess. This book laid out Hitler's ideology in explicit detail, his racial theories, his hatred of Jews, his belief in German racial supremacy, and his plans for territorial expansion. Obsessed with race and the idea of ethnic purity, Hitler saw a natural order that placed the so-called Aryan race at the top. For him, the unity of the Volk, the German people, would find its truest incarnation not in democratic or parliamentary government, but in one supreme leader or Führer. The book was published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926, selling 228,000 copies between 1925 and 1932, with 1 million copies sold in 1933. Hitler's first year in office. Most importantly, the failure of the Beer Hall Putsch taught Hitler a crucial lesson. The Putsch had changed Hitler's outlook on violent revolution to effect change, and from then his modus operandi was to do everything strictly legal. He would achieve power not through armed insurrection, but through the democratic process itself, then use that power to destroy democracy from within. After his release from prison, politics in Germany had become less combative, and the economy had improved, limiting Hitler's opportunities for political agitation. The period from 1924 to 1929 is often called the golden years of the Weimar Republic. The economy stabilized, international tensions eased, and extremist parties like the Nazis found themselves marginalized. But this prosperity was built on a foundation of sand. The German economy was heavily dependent on American loans. And when the Wall Street crash occurred in October 1929, it triggered a global economic depression that hit Germany with devastating force. Unemployment soared, reaching 6 million by 1932. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and the middle class saw their economic security evaporate once again. In this climate of desperation, the Nazi Party found its audience. Hitler blamed Germany's problems on the Versailles Treaty, on Jewish bankers, on communist agitators, and on the weakness of the democratic system. He promised to restore German greatness, create jobs, and overturn the hated treaty. The Nazis combined sophisticated propaganda techniques with brutal street violence, using their paramilitary SA brown shirts to intimidate opponents and project an image of strength. The Nazi electoral performance reflected the country's growing desperation. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis won only 2.6% of the vote. By September 1930, this had surged to 18.3%. In July 1932, they became the largest party in the Reichstag with 37.3% of the vote. While they lost some support in the November 1932 elections, they remained the largest party. Behind the scenes, a fatal political game was being played. The conservative establishment, led by figures like Franz von Papen and influential military leaders, believed they could use Hitler to advance their own agenda while keeping him under control. They fatally underestimated both Hitler's ambition and his political skill. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler as chancellor on the advice of Franz von Papen, a disgruntled former chancellor who believed the conservative bourgeois parties should ally with the Nazis to keep the communists out of power. With 196 seats, the NSDAP had no absolute majority in the Reichstag and would have to rely on coalitions or agreements with other parties to pass legislation. Only 3 cabinet ministers, including Hitler himself, were Nazis. The conservative establishment believed Hitler was their puppet. They were catastrophically wrong. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed as chancellor, the head of the German government. Within weeks, he would transform this position into absolute dictatorship through a combination of legal maneuvering, political intimidation, and manufactured crisis. Hitler immediately asked President von Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag, and a general election was scheduled for March 5, 1933. The Nazis now controlled the machinery of government and used it ruthlessly to suppress their opponents while campaigning. Then came the pivotal moment that would change everything. On Monday, February 27, 1933, precisely 4 weeks after Adolf Hitler was sworn in as chancellor, the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament in Berlin, was set ablaze in an arson attack. The fire came shortly after 9 p.m., and by the time police and firefighters arrived, the structure was engulfed in flames. Police arrested Marinus van der Lubbe, an unemployed 24-year-old Dutch laborer with communist sympathies, at the scene, and van der Lubbe reportedly confessed to setting the fire, saying he did it to encourage a workers' uprising against the German state. To this day, historians debate whether van der Lubbe acted alone or whether the Nazis themselves had a hand in the fire. What is indisputable is how Hitler exploited the incident. Hitler and his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels arrived at the Reichstag just as the fire was being put out, where they met Hermann Göring, Interior Minister of Prussia, who told Hitler, "This is communist outrage." One of the communist culprits has been arrested. Hitler called the fire a sign from God and claimed it was a signal meant to mark the beginning of a communist revolt. The next day, Hitler moved with lightning speed. He persuaded President von Hindenburg to enact the Reichstag Fire Decree, which abolished most civil liberties, including the right to speak, assemble, and protest, and the right to due process. Commonly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, the resulting act for protection of the people and state abolished a number of constitutional protections and paved the way for Nazi dictatorship. The decree nullified many of the key civil liberties of German citizens and was used as a legal basis for the imprisonment of anyone considered to be opponents of the Nazis and to suppress publications not considered friendly to the Nazi cause. Thousands of communists and social democrats were arrested in the following days. The terror had begun. Despite this massive repression in the March 5th, 1933 elections, despite Nazi control of media and political violence by the SA, the Nazis failed to secure an outright majority, receiving 43.9% of the vote. However, with support from the German National People's Party and the silencing of the communist deputies, many of whom had been arrested, the Nazis were able to move forward with their plan to seize total control. The final step came on March 23rd, 1933. The Reichstag assembled at the Kroll Opera House, its temporary home since the Reichstag fire, with SA men positioned inside and outside the chamber. Hitler presented the Enabling Act, officially titled a law to remedy the distress of people in Reich. This act gave Hitler's cabinet the power to decree laws without the approval of the Reichstag, effectively giving Hitler dictatorial powers. The passage of the Enabling Act marked the formal end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of Hitler's legal dictatorship, ratified in a climate of fear and intimidation, with SA troops surrounding the Reichstag building on the day of the vote. The act was passed 444 votes to 94, with only the Social Democrats voting against it, while communist members were barred from attending. The Nazis had rigged the vote through a combination of arrests, intimidation, and backroom deals with other conservative parties. The Enabling Act completed the effect of the Reichstag fire decree, transforming Hitler's government into a legal dictatorship and laying the groundwork for his totalitarian regime. Within months, all other political parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, and Germany became a one-party totalitarian state. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler combined the offices of president and chancellor, becoming the absolute Führer of Germany, with absolute power in his hands. Hitler moved swiftly to reshape German society according to his twisted vision. The transformation was comprehensive and terrifying. All aspects of German life came under Nazi control in a process called Gleichschaltung, or coordination. The legal system was perverted to serve Nazi ideology. Judges and lawyers who opposed the regime were removed, and new laws were enacted that made almost any form of dissent a crime. The Gestapo, the secret state police, became an instrument of terror, with the power to arrest and detain anyone without trial. Concentration camps, initially established to hold political prisoners, proliferated across Germany. The persecution of German Jews began immediately and intensified with each passing year. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Jewish businesses were boycotted, Jewish professionals were barred from their occupations, and Jewish children were expelled from schools. The propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, churned out a constant stream of anti-Semitic content, portraying Jews as subhuman parasites responsible for all of Germany's problems. Education and culture were also Nazified. School curricula were rewritten to emphasize racial theory, German nationalism, and military values. Books by Jewish authors and other undesirables were publicly burned. Art, music, literature, and film were all brought under state control, with only works that promoted Nazi ideology allowed to be produced or performed. The Hitler Youth became compulsory for all young Germans, indoctrinating children into Nazi ideology from an early age. Boys were trained for military service, while girls were prepared for their roles as mothers of the Aryan race. The ideal of the perfect Nazi family, pure-blooded, large, and devoted to the Führer, was relentlessly promoted. The German economy was also transformed, though in ways that would ultimately prove unsustainable. Hitler's government embarked on massive public works projects, most notably construction of the Autobahn highway system. These projects provided employment and created the appearance of economic recovery. However, the real priority was rearmament. In direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, Hitler rebuilt the German military, creating a massive army, air force, and navy. This rearmament was Germany's true economic program. By 1939, the German economy was essentially a war economy, geared entirely toward military production. This was not sustainable in peacetime. The only way for the regime to maintain this economic model was through conquest and plunder of other nations. Hitler's foreign policy was guided by the principles he had outlined in main camps: the destruction of the Versailles Treaty, the unification of all German-speaking peoples, and the acquisition of Lebensraum, living space. in the east at the expense of supposedly inferior Slavic peoples. In March 1936, against the advice of his generals, Hitler ordered German troops to reoccupy the demilitarized left bank of the Rhine. This was a direct violation of both the Versailles Treaty and Locarno Pact. Hitler gambled that Britain and France would not respond militarily, and he was right. This success emboldened him and confirmed his belief in his own strategic genius. Over the next 2 years, Germany concluded alliances with Italy and Japan, annexed Austria, and moved against Czechoslovakia, all essentially without resistance from Great Britain, France, or the rest of the international community. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria and annexed it to Germany in what became known as the Anschluss. The Austrian population largely welcomed this union, and once again, the Western powers did nothing. Next came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population, be transferred to Germany. The crisis brought Europe to the brink of war in September 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times to negotiate with Hitler, desperate to avoid another war. The result was the Munich Agreement of September 1938, in which Britain and France agreed to Hitler's demands, sacrificing Czechoslovakia in the hope of preserving peace. Chamberlain returned to Britain proclaiming peace for our time. Hitler had achieved another bloodless victory. His prestige within Germany reached new heights. But privately, Hitler was frustrated. He had wanted war to test his new military, and diplomacy had robbed him of it. In March 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This finally opened the eyes of the British and French governments to the reality that Hitler could not be appeased. He was bent on conquest. They began preparation for war and issued guarantees to Poland, Hitler's next target. Hitler demanded that Poland cede the city of Danzig and allowed Germany to build a corridor through Polish territory. The Poles, backed by British and French guarantees, refused. Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939, secretly agreeing to divide Poland between them. This shocked the world, as Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union were supposed to be mortal enemies. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was ready for war. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi troops invaded Poland, finally prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany. World War II had begun. The German invasion of Poland demonstrated a new form of warfare that would become known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. Combining fast-moving tank formations, tactical aircraft, and motorized infantry, German forces smashed through Polish defenses with terrifying speed. Within weeks, Poland was defeated, with its territory divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, as agreed in the Nazi-Soviet Pact. After a period of relative quiet during the winter of 1939 to 1940, known as the Phony War, Hitler struck again in April 1940. Hitler ordered the occupation of Norway and Denmark in April 1940, securing vital resources and naval bases. Then came the main event. In May 1940, Hitler adopted a plan proposed by one of his generals to attack France through the Ardennes forest, and the Blitzkrieg attack began on May 10th, with Holland quickly surrendering, followed by Belgium. The German thrust through the supposedly impassable Ardennes caught the French and British completely off guard. French forces, which had been considered among the best in the world, collapsed in confusion. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped and had to be evacuated from Dunkirk in a desperate operation. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, and France signed an armistice on June 22nd. In just 6 weeks, Hitler had achieved what Imperial Germany had failed to do in 4 years during World War I. He had defeated France. The armistice was signed in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, a deliberate humiliation orchestrated by Hitler to erase the shame of Germany's earlier defeat. Hitler now stood at the pinnacle of his power. Germany dominated continental Europe from the Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. Only Britain remained undefeated in the West, and Hitler believed they would soon come to terms. When Britain, under new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, refused to make peace, Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over England in the summer and fall of 1940, saw the German Luftwaffe attempt to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to invasion. For the first time, Hitler's military machine was stopped. The RAF, though outnumbered, fought with determination, and by October 1940, Hitler was forced to postpone the invasion indefinitely. Britain would remain a thorn in Germany's side, a base for Allied operations, and a symbol of resistance to Nazi tyranny. Despite his ongoing conflict with Britain, Hitler made a decision that would ultimately doom his regime: the invasion of the Soviet Union. This had always been his ultimate goal: the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism and the conquest of Lebensraum in the East. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, with over 3 million German troops pouring across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in military history. Initially, Barbarossa seemed to be another German triumph. Soviet forces were caught completely off guard despite numerous warnings. Massive encirclements destroyed entire Soviet armies, and millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Moscow by December 1941. But the invasion had fatal flaws. Hitler had underestimated the size of the Soviet military, the vastness of Russian territory, and the determination of the Soviet people to resist. The German advance, though spectacular, failed to achieve its objectives before winter set in. German soldiers, equipped for a quick summer campaign, found themselves fighting in temperatures of -40 degrees without proper winter clothing. The Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941 drove German forces back from Moscow's gates. For the first time, Hitler's armies had been decisively defeated in a major campaign. The dream of a quick victory in the East evaporated, replaced by a grinding war of attrition that Germany could not win. Yet Hitler refused to accept this reality, dismissing generals who counseled retreat and insisting on fighting for every inch of ground. Hitler's interference in military operations became increasingly destructive. He forbade strategic withdrawals, leading to catastrophic encirclements of German forces. His insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs led to one of the most significant battles in history. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought street by street, building by building, for control of the city. When Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive, they surrounded the entire German Sixth Army. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man. But in February 1943, the remnants of the army surrendered. Over 700,000 Axis soldiers died in the campaign. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, Soviet forces were on the offensive, slowly but inexorably pushing German forces back toward Germany itself. While Hitler's armies fought across Europe and Russia, he was implementing another aspect of his program: the systematic murder of European Jews. What began as persecution and discrimination in the 1930s evolved into genocide during the war years. The Holocaust represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, and it was Hitler's personal obsession that drove it forward. When German forces conquered Poland and then invaded the Soviet Union, they gained control over territories containing millions of Jews. Initially, special SS units called Einsatzgruppen followed the German armies, rounding up and shooting Jews, Roma, communist officials, and others deemed undesirable. These mass shootings claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, but they were deemed inefficient and psychologically difficult for the killers. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, senior Nazi officials coordinated what they called the final solution to the Jewish question: the systematic murder of all Jews in German-occupied Europe. Jews from across the continent were transported to death camps equipped with gas chambers and crematoria designed to kill people on an industrial scale. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek became factories of death. The Holocaust claimed the lives of approximately 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, including Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled individuals, political dissidents, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses. This genocide was not a byproduct of the war. It was a central goal of Hitler's regime, pursued with fanatical determination even as Germany's military situation deteriorated. Hitler's anti-Semitic ideology was the driving force behind the Holocaust. While many people participated in implementing the genocide, from camp guards to railway officials to ordinary citizens who turned in their Jewish neighbors. It was Hitler's vision and authority that made it possible. He created a system in which mass murder became official state policy, rewarded loyalty to his genocidal vision, and created an atmosphere where sadistic cruelty was normalized. While Hitler remained focused on his racial war in the East and his genocidal program, the strategic situation turned decisively against Germany. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States in December 1941, following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, brought the world's greatest industrial power into the war against Germany. This decision, like the invasion of the Soviet Union, reflected Hitler's ideological obsessions rather than strategic calculation. The entry of the United States transformed the war. American industrial capacity dwarfed that of Germany. American factories produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons in quantities that Germany could never match. American troops began arriving in Britain, and plans were made for an invasion of occupied Europe. In North Africa, where Germany had sent forces to support Italy, British and American forces defeated the Afrika Korps in 1942 to 1943, eliminating the Axis presence in the region. The Allies had invaded Sicily and Italy in 1943, knocking Italy out of the war and opening a new front against Germany. The air war over Germany intensified dramatically. British and American bombers struck German cities and industrial facilities around the clock. The British by night, the Americans by day. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, and dozens of other cities were devastated by firebombing campaigns. German oil production, transportation networks, and war industries were systematically destroyed. While this strategic bombing campaign was controversial and caused enormous civilian casualties, it significantly degraded Germany's ability to wage war. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet steamroller continued its advance. The massive Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw Hitler attempt one last major offensive in the East. The Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, prepared elaborate defenses and then launched devastating counteroffensives. German armored forces, which had dominated battlefields earlier in the war, were ground down in the largest tank battle in history. After Kursk, Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. In 1944, Soviet forces liberated Ukraine and then drove into Poland, the Balkans, and toward Germany itself. The scale of the fighting on the Eastern Front dwarfed all other theaters of the war. This was where Hitler's war would ultimately be decided. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy, over 150,000 troops stormed the beaches of northern France, establishing a foothold that would lead to the liberation of Western Europe. Hitler, who had been expecting an invasion at Calais, hesitated to commit his reserves, giving the Allies crucial time to consolidate their positions. The fighting in Normandy was brutal, but by August 1944, Allied forces had broken out and were racing across France. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. British, American, Canadian, and Free French forces pushed toward Germany's western border, while Soviet forces closed in from the east. Germany was being crushed between two massive Allied armies. Hitler refused to acknowledge reality. He continued to believe that Germany could still win through the development of wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket or jet aircraft. In December 1944, he launched one final offensive in the west, the Battle of the Bulge, hoping to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. The offensive achieved initial surprise but was ultimately defeated, costing Germany precious reserves it could not replace. As Allied armies crossed into Germany from both east and west in early 1945, the full horror of Hitler's regime became visible to the world. Allied soldiers liberating concentration camps found scenes of unimaginable horror. Skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, gas chambers, and crematoria. The world would never forget these images, and they would forever define Hitler's legacy. By April 1945, Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. Hitler, who had spent the war issuing orders from his headquarters, retreated to his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. He was a physical wreck, trembling from Parkinson's disease, addicted to drugs administered by his personal physician, and increasingly detached from reality. He continued to issue orders to armies that no longer existed and planned counteroffensives with divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. As Soviet artillery bombarded Berlin and Soviet troops fought street by street toward the city center, Hitler's 1,000-year Reich entered its final days. The Führer bunker, buried beneath 25 feet of concrete under the Reich Chancellery Gardens, became the tomb of Hitler's dreams of German domination. In these final days, Hitler alternated between rage and resignation. He blamed everyone for Germany's defeat, his generals, the German people, fate itself, but never his own decisions. He declared that if Germany was defeated, the German people had proven themselves unworthy and deserved to perish. He issued a Nero decree ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure, resources, and industry to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. His armaments minister, Albert Speer, quietly refused to implement this order, recognizing it as a final madness of a defeated tyrant. On April 29, 1945, with Soviet forces only blocks away from the bunker, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. He then dictated his last will and political testament. Even in these final moments, his obsessions remained unchanged. He blamed the war on international Jewry and urged Germans to continue fighting against them. He showed no remorse for the millions of deaths he had caused, no recognition of the destruction he had brought upon Germany and Europe. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet soldiers fought their way through the Reich Chancellery above, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his private quarters in the bunker. Hitler shot himself in the head while simultaneously biting down on a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried outside to the bunker's emergency exit, doused with gasoline, and burned in a shell crater while Soviet artillery fell around them. Hitler's remaining staff tried to incinerate the bodies completely to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. But Soviet forces discovered the partially burned remains, which were later identified through dental records. The remains were secretly buried and exhumed multiple times by Soviet intelligence before being finally destroyed in 1970, with the ashes scattered in a river. Hitler's last wish, that his body never become a shrine for his followers, was ironically fulfilled by his enemies. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. Hitler's Third Reich, which he had boasted would last 1,000 years, had lasted precisely 12 years and 4 months. The world that emerged from World War II was fundamentally transformed by Hitler's actions. The war he started claimed between 70 and 85 million lives, including approximately 27 million Soviet citizens, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and hundreds of thousands of British, American, French, and other Allied soldiers. Major cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Entire populations had been displaced, murdered, or left homeless. Germany itself was devastated. An estimated 7 million Germans were dead. Major cities were reduced to rubble, and the country was divided between the victorious Allies. The Germany Hitler had promised to make great again was occupied, partitioned, and would remain divided for 45 years during the Cold War. The Holocaust forever changed how humanity thinks about genocide, evil, and moral responsibility. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity, even when acting under orders. The phrase "never again" became a solemn vow that the international community would not allow such atrocities to be repeated, though the world has too often failed to live up to that promise. The war led directly to the creation of the United Nations, an organization designed to prevent future wars through international cooperation and collective security. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was a direct response to the horrors of Nazi Germany and represented humanity's attempt to establish universal standards of human dignity. The balance of global power shifted dramatically. Britain and France, though victorious, were exhausted and would soon lose their colonial empires. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, and their ideological competition would define the next half-century. The Cold War, with its nuclear arms race and proxy conflicts, was in many ways a consequence of the power vacuum created by Hitler's war. For Germany, the reckoning with Hitler's legacy would be long and painful. In the immediate post-war years, Many Germans claimed they had known nothing about the Holocaust or had simply been following orders. But over time, particularly from the 1960s onward, German society engaged in a profound examination of how Hitler had come to power and how ordinary Germans had participated in or enabled his crimes. This process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, became a model for how societies confront their darkest chapters. As we look back at Hitler's rise and the catastrophe he unleashed, the central question remains: how did one man, a failed artist and marginal political agitator, bring about such destruction? The answer is complex and troubling because it reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature, political systems, and fragility of civilization. Hitler did not succeed alone. He was enabled by millions of Germans who supported him, by industrialists who financed him, by generals who served him, by bureaucrats who implemented his orders, and by ordinary citizens who turned a blind eye to the persecution of their neighbors. The Holocaust required the participation of thousands of people at every level, from the planners in Berlin to the camp guards to the railway workers who transported victims to their deaths. He rose to power through a democracy that failed to protect itself. The Weimar Republic's proportional representation system allowed extremist parties to gain parliamentary seats, and its constitution included emergency powers that Hitler exploited to establish his dictatorship. Traditional conservative elites, who thought they could control and use Hitler for their own purposes, instead found themselves swept aside by his radical energy. Hitler succeeded because he understood the power of propaganda, spectacle, and emotional manipulation. His rallies were carefully choreographed theatrical events designed to overwhelm rational thought with emotion. His speeches tapped into primal fears and resentments, offering simple explanations for complex problems and scapegoats for Germany's suffering. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine controlled information, suppressed dissent, and created an alternate reality where Hitler was infallible and his enemies were subhuman. The international community's failure to stop Hitler earlier was also crucial. The policy of appeasement, based on a reasonable desire to avoid another war, instead enabled Hitler's aggression. Each time Britain and France failed to respond to Hitler's treaty violations, he became more confident and emboldened. By the time they decided to resist, Hitler had built an overwhelming military machine, and war had become inevitable. Hitler also exploited a particular historical moment: the devastating impact of World War I, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, and the Great Depression created a population desperate for solutions and willing to embrace radical alternatives to the failed democratic system. In societies where democracy is stable and prosperity is widespread, figures like Hitler struggled to gain traction. But in times of crisis, when traditional institutions fail, demagogues can rise. There's also the uncomfortable reality of Hitler's genuine popularity among Germans, at least until the war began to turn against Germany. He delivered on some of his promises. He restored German military power, overturned the Versailles Treaty, unified German-speaking territories, and appeared to restore German prestige for Germans who supported him. The persecution of Jews and other minorities was either unknown, denied, or rationalized as necessary for national survival. Many Germans genuinely believed Hitler was leading them to greatness, and they followed him willingly into catastrophe. Finally, we must acknowledge the role of Hitler's individual agency. While he was a product of his time and circumstances, he made choices that were not inevitable. Other German politicians faced the same conditions but did not advocate genocide. Other nations experienced economic crisis without turning to totalitarianism. Hitler's particular combination of traits, his charisma, his political instincts, his absolute ruthlessness, his lack of empathy, and his apocalyptic worldview, made him uniquely dangerous. Hitler's legacy is one of death, destruction, and a fundamental challenge to human civilization's self-image. The Holocaust in particular forced humanity to confront the reality that the veneer of civilization is thin, that ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil, and that technological modernity can be weaponized for genocide as easily as for progress. The question of how to prevent another Hitler has occupied political philosophers, historians, and concerned citizens ever since 1945. Some lessons seem clear. Democracies must defend themselves against those who would use democratic freedoms to destroy democracy itself. Constitutional protections and the rule of law must be vigilantly guarded. Civil society, free press, and independent institutions serve as crucial checks on authoritarian power. Education about past atrocities is essential to prevent their repetition, yet the world has not always heeded these lessons. Since 1945, genocides have occurred in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere. Authoritarian leaders continue to rise to power by exploiting ethnic tensions, scapegoating minorities, and undermining democratic institutions. The tactics Hitler pioneered, the big lie, the demonization of enemies, the cult of personality, the use of violence to intimidate opponents, remain in the playbook of would-be dictators around the world. Hitler's name has become synonymous with evil. Hitler is not just a historical figure, but a symbol, invoked in political discourse to represent the ultimate threat. This symbolic status is both appropriate and dangerous. Appropriate because his crimes were indeed uniquely monstrous. Dangerous because overuse of Nazi comparisons can trivialize the Holocaust and make it harder to recognize genuine authoritarian threats. The physical remnants of Hitler's Reich have largely disappeared. The bunker where he died was destroyed. The Nuremberg rally ground stand as ruins, and concentration camps have been preserved as museums and memorials. But Hitler's impact on history is permanent. The borders he tried to redraw, the lives he destroyed, the war he started, these shaped the modern world in ways we still live with today. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, coined the phrase the banality of evil to describe how ordinary people can commit extraordinary crimes when they surrender their moral judgment to an authority figure or ideology. While Hitler himself was far from banal, he was a figure of genuine charisma and diabolic will. The system he created depended on thousands of banal bureaucrats and ordinary citizens doing their jobs without questioning the morality of their actions. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Hitler's story. It does not require monsters to create monstrous outcomes. It requires only ordinary people willing to abandon critical thinking, to dehumanize those designated as enemies, to follow orders without questioning their morality, and to prioritize loyalty to a leader or ideology over universal human values. Hitler believed with absolute certainty in his racial theories, in Germany's destiny, and in his own messianic role in history. This certainty allowed him to commit crimes that would have been unthinkable to someone capable of doubt or self-reflection. He never questioned whether he might be wrong, never reconsidered his anti-Semitic obsessions, never showed empathy for his victims. Even in the bunker, as his empire collapsed around him, he remained certain of his righteousness and blamed others for failure. The story of how one man led the world into World War II is ultimately a story about the danger of certainty, the fragility of civilization, and the consequences of moral failure. Hitler did not create the hatreds and resentments he exploited. They already existed in German and European society, but he organized them, legitimized them, gave them political form, and unleashed them with catastrophic consequences. We study Hitler not because he was aberrant, but because he reveals possibilities that exist within human nature and human societies. We study him because of conditions that enable his rise: economic crisis, political instability, ethnic hatred. The breakdown of democratic norms can occur again. We study him because never again requires eternal vigilance, because the price of freedom is constant attention to those who would take it away. Adolf Hitler was born a nobody in a small Austrian town and died by his own hand in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. In between, he caused more human suffering than perhaps any other individual in history. He did not do it alone. He was enabled, supported, and followed by millions. But it was his vision, his will, and his ruthlessness that set the catastrophe in motion. The Second World War was not inevitable. It was the product of choices made by individuals. And the most consequential choices were made by Adolf Hitler, one man, through a combination of political skill, ruthless ambition, exploitation of circumstances, and absolute moral bankruptcy, led the world into its most destructive conflict. That this was possible is a warning that echoes through history and will remain relevant as long as humans organize themselves into societies. Understanding how Hitler rose to power and the mechanisms through which he exercised that power is not an academic exercise. It is a vital task for every generation because the forces he exploited: resentment, fear, tribal identity, the desire for simple answers to complex problems, the willingness to dehumanize others, remain part human psychology. The structures he abused, democratic institutions, legal systems, bureaucracies, remain vulnerable to those who would pervert them. Hitler's story is not just history. It is a cautionary tale about what humans are capable of, for good and for evil. It reminds us that civilization is an achievement that must be constantly defended, that moral progress is never guaranteed, and that the descent into barbarism can happen with shocking speed when ordinary people abandon their responsibility to think critically, to resist injustice, and to recognize the humanity in all people. What do you think about how Adolf Hitler was able to lead the world into the Second World War? Was he a unique figure whose particular combination of traits made the catastrophe possible? Or was he simply a product of his times who would have been replaced by someone similar had he not existed? How can democratic societies protect themselves from authoritarian demagogues while preserving the freedoms that make democracy valuable? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.